Returning to federal politics now, and I think it's day 11 of this election campaign, but who's counting? Well, I think the Resources Minister, Josh Frydenberg, might be. He joins us from Canberra this afternoon. Thanks so much for your time, Josh. Now, first of all,
nice to be with you.
First of all, to the Immigration Minister's comments today, were you surprised by the reaction to what Peter Dutton said?
Oh, well, this is the great beat-up by the Labor Party. It's the politics of distraction. They're having to fend off questions about David Feeney not listing a negatively geared property of his.
I will get to that in a moment, but was this...
But that's why they raised it. That's why they raised it, Laura. And the point about what Peter Dutton said is he was pointing to some of the challenges we have with settling people who come through the refugee and humanitarian intake, an intake that has increased under the coalition and will continue to increase in the years ahead, because 44% of all females who come to Australia through the refugee and humanitarian intake, and 33% of males cannot comprehend spoken English, and a large number of them, 15%, have never been to school, and 46% of them have not ever held down paid work. Now, this is no fault of their own. They're often coming from war-torn areas, and that's why they're coming through the refugee and humanitarian intake program. But it just raises some of the challenges we have, and that's what Peter Dutton was pointing out as a problem with the Greens policy, because it's uncosted.
But, Minister, was it right to link illiterate refugees and the fact that they might take Australian jobs? For one, Sam Dastyari says he's personally offended. He points out that he came to Australia and didn't speak any English when he arrived.
And so did Arthur Sinodinos, and so did a number of relatives of many of us in the Parliament. And I'm very proud of Australia's history in taking over 850,000 refugees since the Second World War, and we've been very successful in integrating those people from all four corners of the globe into Australian society. Now, we'll continue to be very generous in our humanitarian intake. At the same time, we have to have strict border protection measures in place, and Peter Dutton has been outstanding in ensuring that there hasn't been a unauthorised boat arrival for over 600 days, and we've closed down 17 detention centres, whereas Labor opened 17.
Well, this on David Feeney, what is his biggest crime here? The fact that he failed to register the property, or that he negatively geared in the first place, a policy that Labor is now arguing against?
Oh, it's not a crime to leave something off the register. That could happen to any of us. But I suppose it's the hypocrisy of David's position, because he was tweeting away about how negative gearing was was used by rich people to their own benefit, whereas he was engaged in negative gearing himself with a multi-million-dollar property. So we think the policy as we have it is important. It's been an accepted rule of tax law that you can negatively gear such properties. And the problem with the Labor Party's position and policy is they'll allow you to continue to negative gear off your investment and property income, and that's okay for people like David Feeney, but that's not okay for the 40,000 nurses and the 50,000 teachers who have negative gearing.
Peter Costello has made an interesting intervention today on the government's superannuation changes. The two, they're in the budget, but on one in particular he says, and this is quote unquote, the government said 1.6 million was 4 times the age pension. That is on the assumption of a 5.5% return rate. That is what the government thinks you're going to get. Does it really think that? His rhetorical question. It's issuing bonds at 2%. He has a point, doesn't he, Josh Frydenberg?
No, because we're looking at the long-term rate of return over many years, and it has been solid at 5% or more, and that's why we think that is adequate, and we've reached the right level with $1.6 million worth of assets. I do point out that the Labor Party's position of taxing you at 15% above $75,000 worth of earnings in your retirement phase could mean that you have notionally a lot less than $1.6 million of assets in your superannuation. So theirs is a more punitive scheme than ours, that's for sure.
But Peter Costello has always warned against tinkering with superannuation. He was very critical of Labor. I think in the last term, Labor made 32 changes to superannuation. They would argue not adverse changes, they were fairness measures. But Peter Costello's criticism, essentially, of your policy is pretty serious, isn't it?
Well, Peter Costello was an outstanding treasurer and did so much to lead Australia into greener economic pastures during his long time at the helm. And he continues to be an important voice for the coalition, an important source of advice for many of us in the parliament.
Should we be taking his advice? Because Peter Costello is still a potent voice in this debate. Many Australians will be listening to him. So he's concerned about certainty in the system.
Look, what we have tried to do with these superannuation changes is to go back to the real purpose, Laura, of what is super, as outlined by David Murray in his inquiry, which is that super should be a substitute or a supplement to the age pension. And for that reason, we have drawn the line at $1.6 million. And let's face it, if you've still got money in super above 1.6 million per person, which could be 3.2 million per couple, then you're only taxed at 15%, which is a pretty good concessional rate. And what was very pleasing about the aspects on super in the budget were the fact that we've introduced greater flexibility into the system. Okay. So, for example, many women, 2 million women at the lower end, will now have the benefit of the low-income super tax offset, and people will be able to carry forward their concessional contributions if they're coming in and out of work, as carers may do or working parents may do.
Okay, if I can ask you about another issue now, and that is the backpacker tax. Now, the government is going to review this, but the National Farmers Federation has called on the level of tax for backpackers to be at around 19%. Is that about right in your mind?
Oh no, look, what you saw from the government in the announcement yesterday was that there does need to be further consultation about this particular reform or change, and that's what we'll do in a considered way. We're bringing together the Agriculture Department, the Immigration Department, the Employment Department, Treasury, PM&C.
Sure, but you're not going to scrap this tax altogether. You will have a low rate. For the sake of certainty, once again, should you be giving us a ballpark figure?
Well, I'm not going to go into what that review may or may not find, but the point is we need to listen to the stakeholders. Concerns have been raised, and that's why we have got this extended period of time over the next 6 months before this measure comes into play. And you know what we have to understand is that these backpackers do play an important role in the economy, these working holiday makers, and as Barnaby Joyce pointed out the other day, Laura, in a town called Drake, where you get 1,000 people picking blueberries in the season. It's in a town where there's only 200
Okay,
or so
I do
people
understand that, but the government said that this rate needs to be competitive, particularly with New Zealand. The National Farmers Federation says 19% is its submission. New Zealand has a 12% tax rate for backpackers for those earning up to $14,000. So should it be between 12 and 19%, or should we be undercutting what New Zealand is offering?
Well, Laura, the whole point about this review is to look at Australia's tax system as it applies to these working holiday makers in the global context, what it would mean for local employment, what it would mean for local industries, and we'll get the best possible outcome. And we've given ourselves the 6 months to do that.
Okay, one final question on Labor's gas policy today. Labor says it's a national interest test for gas exports will keep a lid on prices and shore up supplies for business and households. What's wrong with that?
Well, Labor's gas reservation policy is an investment killer. Now, they're not my words. They're the words of the former Labor Energy Minister, Martin Ferguson. And you've also got Gary Gray, another former Labor Energy Minister, who has said that such a reservation policy will be damaging and will not decrease prices. And perhaps most powerfully is not the words of the politicians, it's the words of the ACCC, which less than a month ago, Laura, explicitly ruled out a reservation policy because it said it would be a disincentive to investment. We've got to rely on the market-based mechanisms. We've been a great beneficiary here in Australia of greater investment in the gas sector, some $200 billion in LNG alone over the last decade. It's created tens of thousands of jobs right across the country. We are now working through the COAG Energy Council on the ACCC's reforms. We've cut $4 billion worth of red tape, a lot of which applies to the resources sector. And importantly, finally, in the budget, we announced $100 million of new money for Geoscience Australia to do the geological mapping to help fund further, to help encourage further exploration, which could provide more gas and more gas supplies for the domestic market. That's a lot better than Labor's horrendous policy, which has been ridiculed by its own side as well as by key people in industry.
Resources Minister Josh Frydenberg, we will have to leave it there. Thanks so much for your time.
Great to be with you, Laura.
A quick break here on the latest. When we come back, we'll have a closer look at the government's innovation agenda. Stay with us for that.